All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Georgia Eade. I am a psychiatrist with a special interest in nutrition, and I have a particular fondness for exploring the nutritional differences between animal foods and plant foods, because a number of years I was able to reverse every health problem I ever had by switching to a mostly plant diet, sort of a low-fat diet that most of us were told was healthy, to a meat-based ketogenic diet. So whenever somebody says that meat is not good for us, I become very curious to find out what they're basing that on. So as you may know, I've written about other reports against meat and so forth on my website. So if you're curious to know other ways in which meat is not bad for us, you can read those articles. So my bias, which I think everybody should always state, including people on the World Health Organization, when you're dealing in nutrition research and making proclamations, I do think you should state your biases, because we all have them. So my bias is that meat is healthy for us. I'm at least financially unconflicted. So as many of you know, October 2015, a little over a year ago, the World Health Organization gathered. They convened a subcommittee called a working group. 22 scientists from 10 countries. They met in France to evaluate the carcinogenicity of red meat and processed meat. And then they published a very small report. This is a picture of the entire report upon which that proclamation was based. It's a 2-page report, and it includes 20 references. So that in and of itself is a little suspicious that you could condemn meat with this type of this short of an article. But they do say, if we go back a minute, that their full assessments will be published in volume 114 of their IARC monographs. Nearly a year and a half later, still missing in action. So I don't know when that will be published. But it sort of protects them from scrutiny because they haven't come out with their full arguments. So anyway, the result of their proclamation was that the consumption of processed meat was categorized as carcinogenic to humans, and red meat as probably carcinogenic to humans. And I've seen a lot of published responses to this report criticizing the WHO for overplaying the estimated risk, but I'm not aware of anybody else who's really analyzed the quality of the actual evidence that is in the report, so I thought that would be fun to do. So this is a direct quote from the report. In making this evaluation, the working group took into consideration all the relevant data, including the substantial epidemiological data, showing a positive association between consumption of red meat and colorectal cancer and the strong mechanistic evidence. Poppycock. So why do I say poppycock? Let me defend my response. So first of all, as we in this room know, this premise makes no sense. Evolutionarily, I mean, we've been eating for hundreds of thousands of years, animals cooked over an open flame. My own personal experience, my own personal health experience flies in the face of their condemnations. And real life, what I call real life epidemiological studies, studies of historically, there have been cultures around the world which have subsisted on high meat diets, and they don't have higher rates of cancer than anybody else, in fact, often quite a bit lower. So in any case, that's all kinds of common sense information, but what about the science in the WHO report? So my scientific understanding of red meat is that it's healthy for us. Everything I've ever read convinces me of that. I've never found a shred of evidence that there's any component of red meat that is dangerous to us. I'm not here to defend processed meat, although the WHO does not do a good job of arguing against processed meat either. So I'll show you all of the evidence against both red and processed meat. But my personal philosophy is red meat is safe. I don't know about processed meat. So my conclusion after reading through all of these papers is that the WHO report is not a scientific document. It's a political document. So I'll aim to convince you of that, but you can make up your own minds by the end. Also, if we have time at the end, I did also write what I thought of as perhaps funny, amusing holiday poem in the Dr. Seuss style about the WHO report. So if there's time and you want me to read it too, I'd be happy to. So the epidemiological evidence. So first of all, epidemiology is not evidence. It is basically they're untested theories generated by very flawed questionnaires that generate hypotheses that then need to be tested. So saying that alcoholics are more likely, report eating more pretzels per year, doesn't mean that eating pretzels causes alcoholism. It means that they give out free pretzels in bars. So the WHO looked at over 800 studies about meat and cancer. Now that sounds like a lot of studies. They must have worked so hard to figure this out, and it must all be true. 800 studies. They sort of set aside more than almost 750 of them for unclear reasons, which maybe they'll publish later. And then these were the few dozen studies that they used to support their conclusion that meat causes cancer. So these are the studies of colorectal cancer and red meat, and these are the studies of colorectal cancer and processed meat. 29 studies of colorectal cancer and red meat, 15 of which said that meat was neutral or positive, and 14 of which said that there was a negative association. So right there seems to be a little bit of bias going on here, because who in this room would say that that's conclusive epidemiological evidence against red meat? I certainly wouldn't. I would at least say we don't know. I think that would be a fair thing to say. And then about colorectal cancer and processed meat, it's more tilted against the processed meat. But again, this is epidemiology. So this is just one line of questioning. So the problem with epidemiology, and those of us in this room who spend a lot of time reading nutritional studies, I'm sure we all come across things like this. Here's a quote from the first experimental study that is cited in the WHO report. We're going to go through all of the experimental studies. Believe me, it won't take that long. So this is a direct quote from the author of the first study we're going to look at. In puzzling contrast with epidemiological studies, experimental studies do not support the hypothesis that red meat increases colorectal cancer risk. Among the 12 rodent studies reported in the literature, none demonstrate a specific promotional effect of red meat. So this is a direct quote from the first study that the WHO cites, and none of these 12 studies were included in the WHO report, of course. None of these meat does not cause cancer in rats. None of that was reported. So, epidemiologists are forever sending well-intentioned scientists on time-consuming, expensive wild goose chases, trying to prove that meat is dangerous when all other sources, from anthropology to physiology to biochemistry to botany to common sense, tell us that meat is nutritious and safe. So how many experimental studies do you think they cited in their report? Any guesses? 4. That's not a bad guess. 6. There's 6 experimental studies. How many of them were in humans? 2.5. We'll say 3. Here's the experimental evidence. 3 rat studies, 2 human studies, and 1 study that had a human arm and a rat arm. Not literally. And furthermore, these 4 studies were all done by the same research group. So a lot of problems here, including the fact that there were lots and lots of studies that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into the WHO report. So the first experimental study was of red meat in rats. The objective of the study was to see if heme, the oxygen-carrying compound in red meat, and what gives red meat its dark red color and what distinguishes it from white meat. White meat has heme also, but just not as much. So to see if heme is the devil in the red meat. So they injected rats with azoxymethane, which is a powerful carcinogen. That's step 1. So can I just say that again? They injected the rats with a carcinogen before they did their study. I find that just, I don't know, mind-blowing.
What the purpose of that was?
I think it's to speed the process along so that you don't have to wait the entire rat's life to see if it develops cancer. That's my understanding. But anyway, so they fed the rats a 60% freeze-dried meat diet containing either skinless chicken, which is low heme, lean beef, which is moderate heme, or low-fat pork blood sausage, which is high heme, for 100 days, which in rat years is about 10 years. What did they find?
Freeze-dried meat.
Freeze-dried meat, 60% meat diet, freeze-dried. Poor rats. So the first study, the results. All rats, including the chicken-fed rats, developed potentially precancerous changes in the colon. The more heme the meat contained, the stronger the effect seemed to be. None of the rats actually developed cancer. But wait, we don't want chicken to cause cancer. The scientists didn't, they were out to really pin the tail on the cow, right? So they didn't really want chicken to cause cancer. So they said, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So they went back and they scrutinized the chicken chow to see if they could figure out what the problem was. And what they discovered was that the chicken chow contained more arachidonic acid than the red meat chows. And it also contained, surprise, surprise, toxic levels of niacin. That's the word they use in the paper. And they decided to blame those differences for the unwanted results. But they never went back and looked at the other chows to see what was actually in those other chows. They just decided that because, so in any case, you see what they were doing. There's clear evidence of bias in this kind of study. My interpretation of the study, if you inject yourself with a powerful carcinogen, eat a calcium-deficient powdered chicken, beef, or pork diet every day for 10 years, and you are a rat, your colon may start to look funny. We have no idea whether or not you would eventually develop cancer. Study 2, red meat in rats. And the objective here, this is really just a repetition of the first study, but they put calcium back in. They actually know that calcium protects against potential damage from heme, and so in the first study they removed calcium from the chow. So when they replenish the chow with calcium, the effect goes away, and the colon does not look funny. Translation, adequate dietary calcium protects your colon from looking funny if you find yourself in the unfortunate circumstances described in study 1. Study 3 is of processed meat in rats. So before we look at this study, we have to talk about what the WHO thought of the ways that processed meat might actually cause cancer, like what the mechanisms are, the ways, what it is about processed meat that could be carcinogenic. And these are quotes from the WHO, the 2-page report I showed you. Meat processing results in the formation of carcinogenic chemicals, including N-nitroso compounds and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, excuse me, or PAH. Cooking produces known or suspected carcinogens, including heterocyclic aromatic amines, HAA, and also polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. High temperature cooking produces the highest amount of these chemicals. So those are the 3 mechanistic theories, the strong mechanistic theories that they were basing their report on. So here's the problem. In the next study that we're about to talk about, this processed meat in rat study, the authors themselves shot down those first 2 theories in their paper. So theory 1, processing meat leads to N-nitroso compounds. The problem is that the study's authors point out that when rats are fed a bacon-based diet, this is another study that was cited in the report that didn't end up in the WHO report, bacon is high in N-nitroso compounds, they do not develop signs of cancer. This bacon doesn't cause cancer in rat study was not included in the WHO report. The second theory, again, the authors of this study say, when meat is cooked at high temperatures, yes, heterocyclic amines can form. This can promote cancer in animals. The problem is that chicken cooked at high heat also contains heterocyclic amines. Any protein cooked at high heat will, and the same is true for fish. But chicken is not associated with cancer risk. The second problem is that the doses that caused cancer in animals in those studies were 1,000 to 100,000 times higher than in human food. So they shot down those 2 theories, and I'm going to shoot down the third one. So the third one is about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and the truth is that all charred, smoked, baked, and toasted foods contain polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Any carbon-based heated food will do this, including grilled vegetables, breads, and cereals. And in fact, breads and cereals contribute the highest amount of PAHs to the average person's diet. You can find lots of references about that in the literature, but nobody ever studies the potentially cancerous effects of breads and grilled vegetables, except perhaps for me, because I'm very suspicious of non-animal foods. But these are not the kinds of studies that get done, so we don't really know. So on to this actual study. The objective was to learn which aspects of meat processing might actually cause cancer. Since they didn't put any stock in those other theories, they go, well, what is it about the processing that might cause cancer? It's not PAH, it's not HAAs. So they compared light meat to dark meat, salt curing to nitrite curing, cooking at lower versus higher temperatures, and air exposure versus vacuum packing. So, again, like any good rat cancer researcher, they pre-injected their rats with a carcinogen. Then they added, this poor rat, look at the little guy, add various types of processed meat to a calcium-deficient, high-sugar chow, we're talking 30% sugar in these chows, and feed it to rats for 10 rat years. The results, the type of processed meat that caused the worst precancerous changes was the dark meat with the sodium nitrite cooked at the higher temperature, left unwrapped in the refrigerator for 5 days. And still, no matter how hard they tried, the researchers could not get any of these rats to develop cancer.
So maybe it was protected against the carcinogen.
Right, that's a good point. So translation, if you inject yourself with a powerful carcinogen, then eat a calcium-deficient, high-sugar diet containing badly packaged cooked ham every day for 10 years, and you are a rat, your colon may start to look funny. We don't know whether you'd ever get cancer. So on to the human studies, because we can relate to those better, and we care a lot more about those. The fourth study was about rats and humans. We're not going to look at the rat arm of the study because A, it's not as interesting to us, and B, the results were very similar. They're slightly different, but in any case, this is a quote from the authors of Study 4, basically saying that the rat represents a poorly fitted model to test an overloaded meat diet, and that excesses of meat in a species such as a rodent may create toxic pathways that are, otherwise wouldn't be stimulated. So. And that's why they decided to include a human arm in the study. So bottom line is, of course, rats are not people. So their objective was to see if processed red meat causes cancer in humans. So they fed 6.3 ounces of the aforementioned badly packaged ham. Remember, this is the same research group for studies 1 through 4. So they've got the same meat hanging around in the fridge. To 17 healthy men for 4 days. And then they tested their urine and stool samples for 5 different cancer biomarkers. This is where it gets a little complicated. So obviously you can't do a study where your outcome is cancer in a human being, because it would take many decades, you would never be able to control it properly, and it would be unethical. So I understand you can't look directly at cancer outcomes. You have to look at indirect measures such as biomarkers, but let's see what these biomarkers actually are. So they looked for these 5 biomarkers. Excuse me. So ATNC, which is apparent total N-nitroso compounds, which can be formed if you eat too many nitrates or nitrites. TBARS, which is a measure of oxidative stress. Fecal water cytotoxicity, which is a measure for apoptosis, stimulating cell suicide. And DHNMA, which is a measure of oxidative damage. And GH2AX, which is a measure of DNA damage. So after feeding the badly packaged ham to these men, they looked at their body fluids to see what they could figure out. So the first 2 biomarkers did increase in the men who were eating the badly packaged ham. The fecal water cytotoxicity and DHN, these 2 biomarkers stayed the same, and this biomarker may have been slightly decreased, but not significantly so. So what does this mean? Oh, and these asterisks are just to say that when they added calcium back into the diet and vitamin E, both of the markers remain normal. So everything looked fine as long as vitamin E and calcium were in the study. But in any case, what does this mean? Should we be worried about this? I don't know whose computer this is. Thank you, Rick. What I wanted to do was get a feel. I'm not a cancer researcher. I'm not an oncologist. Do we have any oncologists in our group today? I don't think so. I wanted to try to get a feel for what oncology specialists, what oncology researchers think of these biomarkers, because I'm not a cancer researcher. I read through and tried to figure that out from the literature, and I came across a lot of things that convinced me, and this was a good summary. There was a meta-analysis about total nitroso compounds. So this, essentially the carcinogenicity of apparent total nitroso compounds formed in the gut after eating heme is unknown. Translation, even if badly packaged ham raised your levels of these compounds, we really don't know whether or not they cause cancer. So unknown. The next biomarker, TBARS, is apparently widely believed to be insufficient. It's received a lot of criticism over the years. It's not sensitive, it's not specific, it's apparently very promiscuous, reacts with all kinds of things, and so cannot be considered representative of oxidative stress. So in my reading of the literature, the TBARS test is useless. Apparently it's inexpensive, and that's one of the reasons why it's still used. So the first two, we can call this into question. At least I'm calling it into question. And these others we don't need to worry about since they didn't change, or they may have even improved a little bit. So fecal water cytotoxicity, from what I could tell from the literature, seems to be a pretty good biomarker for apoptosis. DHNMA seems to be a pretty good marker of oxidative stress. And GH2AX is considered a very reliable marker for DNA damage. So we should pay attention to those. But if you wish, you can pay attention to all of them, because I still wouldn't worry. So the translation, my translation of that study is, if you eat 6.3 ounces of badly packaged ham for 4 days in a row, your urine and stool will be higher in 2 substances that have no proven connection to cancer. The authors of study 4 refer within their study, I don't know if the WHO actually read these 6 papers that they cited in their report. The authors of study 4 refer to a human study that found vegetarian diets resulted in higher levels of that very reliable marker of DNA damage than diets containing cured meat or red meat. This vegetarian diets may cause cancer study was not mentioned in the WHO report. Study 5, red meat in humans. So no rats in this study, rat-free zone. It's a 2-part study. The objective was to see if heme from red meat caused mutations in human colon cells. So the first step was they added about 11 ounces of lean beef or lamb plus 2 cups of orange juice or low-fat milk to the diets of 23 people for 28 days. And then these poor people underwent rectal biopsies to find out if they had a particular kind of mutation in their colon cells called O6MEG. And they also looked for apparent total nitroso compounds. So the part B, it was a 2-part study, remember. The second part of the study, the objective was to see if butyrylated starch, which is a fiber supplement, protects human colon cells from those mutations. So they repeated part A of the study, but they added this fiber supplement to the milk or the orange juice. That was the purpose of the milk or orange juice being included in the study, was to have something to mix the fiber supplement into. So the results were no change in the total nitroso compounds, but a 21% increase in these O6MEG adducts, which are mutations in colon cells. And when they included the fiber, this increase did not occur. But you know, this is worth paying attention to, right? So, so I wanted to understand about this O6MEG mutation and whether or not I should be worried about it. I eat a ketogenic diet where the source of protein is from animals, not exclusively red meat, but I do include red meat in my diet, and I feel great on this diet. But you know, maybe it's going to cause cancer in 10 or 20 years. I want to know that. So should I be worried about O6MEG? It turns out, sorry about that slide. It turns out that there's an enzyme ubiquitous in the human body, including in colon cells, called MGMT, whose sole purpose in life is to go around repairing O6MEG damage, OCGMEG mutations, because apparently they're very common mutations and they're happening all the time as a part of daily life. And so that's why we have this enzyme. And cancer researchers, again, I read quite a few articles to get to the bottom of this, they do believe that cancer doesn't occur simply as a result of these mutations, and especially for those of us who don't necessarily believe in the mutation theory of cancer to begin with, but you can be at higher risk if your repair systems aren't working properly. It's a very different question. But even so, even if you were very afraid of those mutations, and some people may be, the study was not designed in a way which could tell us whether or not you should be afraid. The authors did not report what else the volunteers were eating over those 4 weeks, except that their diets now included a certain amount of red meat, some milk and or orange juice. And we don't know how many people, people I guess got to choose milk or orange juice. And I don't know if they didn't describe, like, they could choose a different beverage each day. How many people were drinking, how many people drank milk, how many people drank orange juice. Milk and orange juice are very different. So that's one major variable that is off. But also during the high meat phases of the study, participants ate significantly more protein and significantly less fiber than during the low meat phases of the study. Therefore, the study wasn't properly controlled. So my opinion is that if you include 10.6 ounces of lean beef or lamb plus 2 cups of milk or orange juice in your usual diet every day for a month, biopsies of your rectum will show a 21% increase in the usual number of mutations in your colon cells. We do not know whether it was the red meat, orange juice, milk, higher protein, lower fiber, or some other aspect of your diet that led to the increase in that mutation rate. And these mutations are furthermore typically automatically repaired by the body and do not increase your risk for cancer. The last study the objective was to demonstrate the effects of red meat or heme and fiber on colon mutations in humans. In this case, they did a really good thing. They confined people to a metabolic ward, 25 people, where you can control absolutely everything they eat and measure everything. And then they fed them, excuse me, one of the following diets for 10 days, either a vegetarian diet, a low fiber diet containing about 15 ounces of red meat per day, or a high fiber diet containing about 15 ounces of red meat per day. And then they took stool samples and looked for total nitroso compounds and a different kind of mutation called O6CMG. So in the low fiber meat diet compared to the vegetarian diet showed higher nitroso compounds and higher levels of O6CMG mutations. So what about these O6CMG mutations? Are those scarier than O6MEG mutations? Well, the MG, it was, when this study was done, which was back in 2006, it was thought that this enzyme couldn't repair those O6CMG mutations, which is exactly why they chose to use those instead of O6MEG. But then in 2013, it was discovered that they actually can. So it's hard to know, how much faith to put in these mutations as a marker for cancerous, but I think it's important to pay attention. So the results, ATNC, because the reliability is unknown, I would call that scariness into question. And here we've got a mutation that's repaired by our enzyme systems if they're working properly. But in any case, even if you are afraid of O6CMG mutations, this study was not done, unfortunately, in a way that can tell us whether or not we should worry. Because even though these people were confined to a metabolic ward, it was not reported in the study what they ate. And this is this huge oversight. Why confine them to a metabolic ward in the first place? So we have no idea how much carbohydrate, protein, or fat they ate. The low fiber meat group was fed refined carbohydrates in place of the high fiber food, so that was their control, and that's a very common issue. If any volunteers started losing weight, they didn't want weight to be a variable, they fed them buttered marmalade bread to get their weight back up to normal or to their previous weight. We have no idea which volunteers got these sugary marmalade breads or how often. And there was no non-red meat animal protein control like chicken or fish, so we don't know if all types of animal foods would cause this or not. So this is a study that's really interesting, and gee, maybe there's something there, but it would really need to be repeated and done in a much better way in order to convince me that I should worry. So, translation, if you eat a low fiber, high protein, high refined carbohydrate diet that includes almost 15 ounces of lean red meat for 10 days, your colon cells will experience more mutations than usual. We have no idea what aspect of the diet might be responsible for this, and these mutations are typically automatically repaired by the body if everything is working properly. So of all the different theories I came across in the cancer literature about how red meat might be worse than other kinds of meat, the theory about heme is the most compelling one because that's the only real difference between red meat, like dark meats, and light meats. So maybe it's the heme. So I thought, well, maybe I should worry about that. Maybe I should pay attention to my heme intake, or what should I tell people? Excuse me. So I came across this very helpful quote from the USDA's National Program Leader for Human Nutrition, which says, this was 2015, which is the same year that the report came out. While heme iron can increase cell proliferation in the colonic mucosa of mice and catalyze the formation of N-nitroso compounds in rats, there's no data that normal levels of heme in human intestine contributes to any harm. And this is by David Klurfeld, USDA leader for human nutrition, who also happens to be, to my great surprise, one of the members of the WHO working group. So he himself does not believe that heme is harmful. So let's just recap these rodent studies. The first 4 studies were of rats, all injected with a carcinogen. This is the calcium replenished rat, so it's really not a 4th study. And then these were the studies only that, this represents all of the red and processed meat is not dangerous to rodents experiments that I found only within those 6 papers. I didn't go looking through the literature for more, because there's plenty more, I'm sure. But these were 12 studies that were mentioned in the papers that the WHO chose, handpicked, to support its arguments, which show that red and processed meat are fine. But these studies were not included in the WHO report and not addressed by the WHO report. So many flaws in the WHO report: cherry-picking anti-meat studies, ignoring pro-meat studies, ignoring anti-plant studies, relying almost entirely on epidemiological studies, including experimental studies with serious methodological flaws, and citing outdated or disproved mechanistic theories. So I don't know if they're right or wrong. They certainly haven't proved their case to me. But I think it does matter. I think if you're not sure if red meat causes cancer, you really shouldn't be going around proclaiming to the world that it does, because there are many reasons to keep red meat in the diet, particularly in certain vulnerable populations. I found an excellent quote in one of the papers I was reading saying, strong media coverage and ambiguous research results could stimulate consumers to adopt a safety-first strategy that could result in abolishment of red meat from the diet completely. However, there are reasons to keep red meat in the diet. So there are plenty of populations who are vulnerable to anemia and vitamin deficiencies and very little resources. And if you only have a little bit of money and you have to choose a protein source, you might choose against red meat, even though it might be your best bet dollar for dollar, if you're worried that it's going to cause cancer. So I think it's irresponsible of the WHO to have done this. So as we all know in this room, meat is a superior source of most nutrients compared to plant foods, and in some cases the only source of certain nutrients. So I think it's very important to have animal foods included in the diet. And as I was saying, that monograph, volume 114, which is supposed to flesh out their reports a little bit more, is still missing. 114 still hasn't been published. I just checked a few days ago. It still hadn't been put up. So I don't know if they can defend themselves better than they have, but so far I haven't seen anything for me to worry about. Furthermore, there was in 2013, just a couple of years ago, a group of cancer experts from 8 countries met in Norway, and they looked at the colon cancer science and red meat. The interactions between meat, gut, and health outcomes are very complex and are not clearly pointing in one direction. Epidemiological and mechanistic data on associations between red and processed meat and colorectal cancer are inconsistent. Underlying mechanisms are unclear. Better biomarkers are needed for future studies, which is exactly what I found when I went through the actual report. So, in my opinion, what we've got against red meat, according to the World Health Organization, is 2 very questionable, seriously flawed human studies that say that red meat might not be good for you. So, as a psychiatrist, I understand that believing is seeing. So if you believe for whatever reason, I mean, there are many reasons to consider eating less red meat or not eating red meat, but none of them, in my opinion, have to do with health. It's not about health, it's maybe about something else. And people should be able to make their own choices, but they should have the correct information on which to base those choices, rather than the WHO saying that the entire world needs to avoid red meat for health reasons. I think that the science is simply not there. That's why I say this is a political document. So if you choose not to eat red meat, that's your personal choice. But I don't think that there are any health reasons to avoid it. So that's what I've got. Any questions?
We take one question.
Yes.
Can I? There's data out of the Cleveland Clinic that, first of all, I
totally agree with that red meat, healthy red meat, as opposed to red meat filled with meat glue and garbage like that.
Oh,
you know?
sure,
So,
right.
you know, talking about like the real red meat, which most people don't get access to, which is a problem.
Right.
But in terms of the microbiome, the work out of the Cleveland Clinic showed that if you have the wrong microbiome and you have dysbiosis, and then you consume certain animal products that contain like carnitine and choline, which come like from eggs and red meat, and other animals, not just red meat, other animal products, that the gut bacteria create what is a toxic product called TMA.
TMAO.
No, it's TMA in the gut, and then it goes to the liver, where it becomes the oxide. So it becomes transmethylamine oxide in the liver, and it is in the gut it's toxic, and in the circulation it's toxic. So I think that what's happened when you have studies that say something like eating meat, which we know cannot be evil because
Right.
humans have eaten it, it's not that, it's our modern society which has poisoned so much of our food and water, that has created a dysbiotic microbiome in so many people that they can't properly process these products within us.
Well,
So
I would respectfully disagree with that premise, because I did tear apart another paper specifically about TMAO. I'll show it to you after if you'd like, or I can give you the link. There's no, it's a very, there's no there. And I don't have the report right in front of me, but I can show it to you.
Well, I'm certainly
So-
not saying that it gives you colon cancer, and I'm just saying
Yeah.
that it's
But
a
the
toxin.
TMAO itself is,
You know,
is-
I've read, well, we can look
there-
at, I've read a
I'll
lot
look
of
at
the
it with you
papers
together,
on it,
yeah.
but that's my concern, is that we're not capable in our modern life of dealing with healthy foods because of our gut microbiome and such, metabolizing it improperly.
Any other questions?
Okay, one more question.
Sure, Deborah?
But this is, right, so can't you get vitamin K2 from sauerkraut? Don't
And
all
not
fermented foods have, all fermented foods have vitamin K2, so that's just a correction to that. It's not, it's only
Well,
found
it's-
unfermented in animal food.
Well, it's because it comes, my point that being that it comes from bacteria, not from the actual unprocessed plant food. Yeah, that's all I meant by that.
Thank you.
You're welcome, doesn't naturally occur.
Yes, you're
Okay,
right.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right.